Is it possible to paint this like this without using these? Today's is a challenge of saturation. By removing black and white from my repertoire, I'm forced to use color pigments and mixes in order to create layers and effects on the model. And I do mean all black and white, by the way, so pigments like this cerulean blue hue that has a white pigment in it would be off limits. However, I do have a secret weapon to help me, which I'll show off a little later. And because this one will be all about mixes, it will be a little bit of a palette heavy video. For now though, I want to explain the model I'm going to use, since this is also going to be a bit of a copycat color scheme. When Legacy of Atmos reached out about painting a model, they said I could pick any one I wanted, and while much of the range is pretty stellar, I'm going with a Rhydox, because I feel I could replicate its artwork's color scheme with this challenge. With the glowing crystals and grassy hide, there's lots of saturation, and I can see potential ways to play with hue as well, to add my own spin. But most importantly, I think his colors will work best with my secret weapon, and that's this vanilla yellow from the Scale Artist line. Even though it looks like just a white mixed with a yellow, it is a single pigment paint. Pigment Yellow 53, Nickel Antimony Titanium Yellow Ruddle. It's the lightest single pigment paint that isn't white that fits the rules of this challenge, which means everything I want to be lighter is going to have a tint of yellow. I'm going to start with the lowest layer on the model, which is going to be his short light brown fur. You can see in the shadows that it actually has a bit of a blue tint. This is good for me because it gives me a nice color for a base layer to work from. Not even anything I have to mix, just straight ultramarine blue. I'm going with ultramarine as opposed to a phthalo this time, as ultramarine is a less intense blue. A phthalo would stain quite dark, but since this is just for shadows, I want something that's more of a hint of blue rather than an all-out assault. I'm using my airbrush for simplicity and make sure I do a few solid coats of it, so that I'm not cheating and working from the gray base, which of course has black and white. To mix up the start of the brown layer, I've got quite a few browns on my palette along with my secret weapon, a raw and burnt umber and a burnt sienna, which is the reddish one. Starting with the raw umber, as it's the closest brown I want to get to, I lighten it up with some of the vanilla yellow. But because that makes it too yellow, by adding some of the burnt sienna, it shifts those hues more towards the orange again, which is the base for most browns. I got the color I'm looking for, but not exactly the right shade for the base, so added some more of the umbers to darken it just a bit before getting it in my airbrush. To get it on the model, I do pretty much a light layer over the whole of the blue base coat. At first I was going to leave some of the shadows, and indeed I do in his leg pits as it were, but I thinned it out quite a bit, so it's transparent enough to dull the blue, but not really change much of the hue. That is, until the second layer, when I added a bit more of the mix I made without any additional thinner for a larger concentration of pigment. And I was more selective in the application, around the base of his legs, and angling the airbrush to catch only the upper parts of his snout. In the artwork, there's little spots of orange fur. Not super orange, but just a bit off hue of the brown. So I want to get some of those in right now, using my previous mix and adding some of the burnt sienna again. Then using a fine brush, I go around and make random downward swipes along the grain his fur would have. Later, some of these should stand out and register as being a lower level in the fur pattern. To start the actual fur pattern, I have to again lighten my shade, and so to the original brown mix, just add a bit of my secret weapon, just enough to lighten it slightly without going too far into yellow. With this and my fine brush again, I create a more dense fur pattern, drawing thin parallel lines along the grain the fur would have, though also adding crosshairs so the pattern isn't too uniform. Then, because my lines were quite thin, I actually go over it all again with a second coat of the pattern, just to fill in some spaces around where I want it to cover a bit more completely and opaquely. Once that's done fully, while I still have that orange from earlier, I want to add a few more just to the work I've already done. A few stray hairs here and there. The middle layer of the fur, as it were. For my brightest layer, it takes a little more of that vanilla yellow, but also a tiny bit more of the burnt sienna to make sure it doesn't work its way into being a yellow-brown. adding some of the umber as needed as well, just to make sure it's fractionally lighter than my last layer. I paint the hairs in exactly like I did the last ones, just a little more spaced out and towards the highlight points near the base of the legs more than the upper sides of them, picking out some of the textured furs at the base of his legs that are actually part of the model as well. And for the heck of it, why not? Let's add a few more stray orange hairs, but lightened up a bit with some more of the vanilla yellow, just a few here and there around the surface layer. They won't stand out too much, but catch the light the right way and they should be seen. The last thing I want to do is blend out some of the shadows again into the fur pattern, darken it up in those shadowy areas. So using my airbrush, I just use a small amount of the ultramarine blue again, and spray it carefully into the shaded recesses, giving the area over those fur patterns a bit of a blue tint, but not too much that it'd obscure any of those fur details painted in. Though I'm done with the fur pattern, I'm not quite done with the fur. The model has some sculpted fur as well that isn't the grass on his back, and so I'll want to shore that up with some of the browns before moving on to the more saturated colors. Starting with a mix of the burnt umber and a phthalo blue. The blue will darken it up a bit without the use of black and give me a nice base coat to work from. That mix gets brushed over all the sculpted fur, using the reference picture as a guide if I'm ever not sure where the fur and the grass begin. Though in the reference they do blend a bit together as well, which I'll get to later, but means I'll have to base coat a little bit into the grass as well, just to make sure that it's there when I need to get to it instead of the gray primer. Now technically this fur belongs to the first layer I did, only that it has some depth to it now, but that doesn't mean I don't want them to play nice. So I'm mixing up a bit of transparent wash from that base, and with this I wash around the edges of the sculpted fur where it meets my textured fur. This way not only do I get the deeper recesses with that base, but also blend out the transition a bit from one color to the other, since they're technically all one pelt of fur. I'm only planning on layering with this fur as the detail is already there in the model, and the burnt umber looks to be almost exactly the color it should be, so no mixing on this one at the moment, and I just go in with a straight burnt umber to layer in with a thin brush over the fur, making sure the layer gets a pointed tip should the curve of the fur require it. To lighten the hair up a bit, I'm going to use yellow oxide instead of vanilla for now, because I don't want it too bright at the moment. Then using my sharp brush again, make a layer on the highest ridges of the sculpted fur. I don't want to get too heavy or bright with this as the artwork that has the fur is quite dark, but I do want some of those details to stand out a little bit. That said, I do want it to be a little more opaque on the tips, so once it dries the first time, go over the tips again with the same color just to make sure it's opaque. For the last little flare, I'm going to mix the vanilla yellow into the pure burnt umber. This should only be a little brighter than the pure burnt umber so as not to be too yellow or too bright. With this, much like the orange used in the previous color of fur, I pick out stray hairs here and there to give it a more natural thick fur look. By adding these little irregularities along some of the ridges, I can also use it to point out highlight directions. Looking at the artwork, I can see in the little shadowy areas of his back that the grass needs to start from a bluish green base, but also not too dark. So to make that mix, I'm going to have phthalo green and blue, but also some yellow oxide. Since yellow and blue make green, yellow is actually a really good color for brightening up a green without making it too pastel like what can happen with white. Though in this case, I need mostly just the green and blue for a teal base, using the yellow just so it's not too dark to start. This is another simple base coat over all the green grass along his back, though I have to change things up a bit as I start to paint where I overlap the brown fur and green grass, wet blending a bit between them using what I already had on my palette for the base mix of the fur. When it comes to highlighting the grass, it'll be done in much the same way as the sculpted fur, but just with green colors, starting with some phthalo green and some yellow oxide. The pure green would be too dark, so I want to lighten it up, but keep it mostly green, which is why I'm using the darker yellow instead of the vanilla yellow again. This mixture is still quite transparent, so to start I'm going to fill in some of the major highlight areas. Not really a wash, just a wet layering, just because it'll take a few coats of the green to get an opaque coverage, so this will help out in the thicker areas of the grass. After that dries, I add more of the yellow oxide and start to pick out each and every blade of grass here. The only thing to really look out for is where it blends into the brown. By doing some thinner lines with a smaller brush, to add some of the green, but not cover over the brown. I do also have to double up in some places just to make sure it's really opaque in those highlight areas. Because this isn't fur, I don't want to pick out the hairs like I did on the sculpted fur. Adding some of my vanilla yellow to lighten the previous mix, I use a fine brush again, but this time the plan is to actually pick out clusters of light points, so go for an overall highlight instead of the light catching individual furs. The flow of the grass along his back leaves hills and valleys, so picking out those instead of each individual blade of grass I think will be a better overall look for the model. In the artwork, the mushrooms are on the orangish red side of things, so I like a couple colors for that, red oxide and burnt sienna. Since they are orange, once again, blue's a good candidate for darkening them up a little for my base layer, but I don't want it much darker, so I'm going with the ultramarine blue for a subtle shift for now. I'm making a mix for each of the red browns with a bit of blue. For the mushrooms themselves, I'm going to paint the lower part the darker burnt sienna and the cap the red oxide. This way, there will be slight differences in color, but remain relatively in the same ballpark to each other. Just a simple base coat on the both of them. Once the original base coat was dry, I gave each of the mushrooms a supplemental coat of the raw colors used to make the base coats, keeping the paint thin so that it's a little transparent to retain some of the darkness from the layers under it. To make the highlight mix, I'll use a bit of my secret weapon, but also a bit of raw umber, just to keep the tint of the yellow more towards orange, and mix this into the raw browns. Just a little bit at first. This gets layered lightly on the relevant highlight points of the mushrooms, about the center for the undersides and the edges for the caps. For the final highlight to the mushrooms, I add just a bit more of my brown-yellow mix to the previously used colors. This one is just for the highest ridges of the round points along the rims of the mushrooms, using the edge of the brush to create the line highlight. I want to have a little bit of fun with the colors here, just because I think a bit of red or magenta will go really nicely with the overall saturation I have going on with the model already. So I add a bit of red and magenta together since I don't want it too pink, just on that side of things. Then in the center of the caps where I left the shade, blend that red outwards from the center of it. Only one layer of this is needed because I just want that little pop of color in something that isn't brown or green. Last but not least will be the crystals. I wasn't really sure what my plan was going to be for these going in. I could just do a blue and vanilla yellow highlight like I normally would, but it's also a great opportunity to add a lot of spice and color. So here I'm mixing up 6 different shades of blues, using magentas and purples, greens, and of course the main blue in a few different shades, from dark to light, using that vanilla yellow into a phthalo blue. Since phthalo blue has a strong tint strength, it should stay more blue than turn green. Why so many colors? Well, because instead of trying to paint a gradient on all these crystal faces, instead I'm going to paint each face a different shade. The green shade is for any bottom face that opposes some of the green grass, as if the grass's color is affecting the light glowing through it. The light green shade, of course, is for the upper faces of the crystal facing away. The purple is for the bottom faces towards the body, since those would be mostly shadowy. Then to match them, I add the light magenta to the top faces pointing towards the body. Unfortunately, not every crystal is going to adhere to these rules, so sometimes I'll just have to use some judgment. Now that I've added some color, for the other 3 blues, I'll pick out faces based on the angle as best as I can, holding the model in one direction towards my viewpoint. I'll add the lightest one to the faces that face directly towards me. The medium one is for all the faces in between. It's not a huge deal if this one fills in a couple side by side, since they will get an edge highlight to separate them. And the darkest blue for the faces that angle away from my view, usually the lowest facets of the crystal. With the base coats done and the crystals picked out, I can do a gentle edge highlight. If I added just a bit of blue to the yellow, because there's more yellow now, I end up with a bright green. But since purple is a contrasting color to yellow, by adding some of that in, I can neutralize it to make it more of a dull green instead. With this mix, I get my finest brush and start to edge highlight all the edges of the crystals. At first, I thought using the side of the brush would be best, but I found it was actually easier to use the tip of the brush to draw a straight line and just twist the model into the right angle that made making that line most comfortable for my fingers. Needless to say, this is going to take some time. Using some of the raw vanilla, I pick out a few highlight points along the way, just the tips of the sharp crystals, and any large faces, I add a few parallel light sweeps to them. So these look pretty nice at the moment, but what good's a crystal that doesn't glow? I'm going to first shade the bases of them, catching the grass at the same time. Just a bit of the phthalo blue, lightly spraying this at the bases of the crystals, and getting a bit on the grass as well. It should be pretty transparent though, because I'm not going too heavy with the dark color. Then I add some medium blue into the airbrush and start to aim towards the grasses a bit more, giving each of the crystals a little halo around where they extrude out of the beast. This one's a bit heavier as it needs to be lighter to represent a glow, though doing that by just tinting the colors slightly. Lastly, I add a bit of the raw vanilla yellow in a pretty saturated way, thinning it just enough that it'll actually flow through the airbrush. With this, I find some of the thicker faces, and just in a corner and places, add a little gradient. A quick spray up close should do nicely, just to have some glare coming off the faces of these stones. I finished the hooves with mixes of browns and blue, the teeth with browns, dark reds, and the yellow, and his mouth with some red, purple, and magenta. Just so you know I didn't cheat. Same goes for the base as well, not a single black or white pigment. The model has an overall blue hue to him as there was a lot of blue used, but things like the mushrooms really stand out because of that. This model was a lot of work, and there may have been easier ways to do some of the things, but as daunting as picking out every fur, blade of grass, and crystal face seems, it really wasn't that bad. As far as the challenge goes, it was actually a lot of fun remembering my color wheel and how contrasting colors can really change a mix. Adding purple to yellow, for example, to dull a color mixed in instead of gray. Please subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this one, or just other fun things to do with painting miniatures. And until next time, enjoy your own painting journey.